I do think change is afoot and will continue to be afoot. And I say that because, when I go on meetings, I see a lot of people who look like you and I, behind the scenes, the people who actually enable this work to go through the channels and actually get to the screen. But also, too, I think when I think of Oscar So White or whatever happened last year, what I see is something similar to the National Football League in America, where there weren't enough black head coaches, and so they did research and realized they weren't interviewing black candidates. And so they said, you don't have to hire a black coach, but we are going to mandate that you have to interview at least a person of color. And I think with Oscar So White, if you saw my film, just by the synopsis, you would assume, oh, a film about a poor black kid growing up with a drug-addicted mom. I know what that film is. But I think because of the uproar last year, rather than assuming you know what the film is, people felt like, well, I'm actually going to watch this. And then you watch it, it's like, oh, that's not what I expected. And so I think that's been the effect.
One of the things I think is interesting is you said that American society forces black men to fortify themselves. Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that? And in depicting something so different, what were you trying to do?
We get into the weeds, but it goes back to the history of African Americans or black people in America, which is we were brought over as slaves and placed into bondage. And I think when we obtained our freedom, I think for black men, you had to be extremely masculine because there was always the threat that the freedom would be taken away from us. So I think the performance of masculinity by necessity in the black community has always been, in some cases, a matter of life and death, a tactic for survival. And I think different portrayals or different presentations of masculinity are less well known, And I think the more I think as time goes on, they will become more well known. And I think there's always this conflict about these things that we don't see very often, these things that we're not familiar with.
Thinking about the real life characters like yours, a young black man growing up in poverty, struggling with sexuality. Mm-hmm. In the era of President Trump, is life going to become more difficult for those young men?
In a certain way, it seems so. I mean, it seems like life is going to become more difficult for anyone who doesn't identify in a very particular way, in a very narrow way, I should say. As an artist, and I think just purely as a human being in America, I do think that there are a lot of people who won't take this sort of change, sitting down. I think the Women's March that we had the day after the inauguration is proof positive of that. Will life become harder? I think so, but I think people are going to pay more attention, and so whatever difficulty is created, I think it's going to be met with action, political action.
You seem positive. Are you afraid in any way?
I'm a glass half full kind of person, and again, we had the inauguration and we had all this mess about crowd sizes and things like that, and then we had a legitimate crowd that was protesting the new regime, and so I think even just in the rhyme of those 2 days, glass half empty, we had this inauguration where, I think a campaign was run in some very dark ways, and then the very next day we had a very positive response, which was all these citizens exercising their First Amendment right to protest. So I'm going to go with that latter part. Also, too, 3 million more people voted for the other candidate, and so I am hopeful that 3 million more, glass half full, not glass half empty.
You said this film is not what you expect. Mm-hmm. Just seeing two young black men talking about what makes them cry, mm-hmm. exploring their sexuality, that is still unusual. Mm-hmm. And you've got lots of praise for exploring that. Mm-hmm. Why is it so important?
I think if you don't see yourself reflected in arts and letters, in media, we're surrounded by screens all the time. If you don't see your life reflected on those screens, you either feel A, that you're alone, or B, that you're invisible. So I do think it's important to bring these conversations to light, bring these acts of kindness, these gestures of nurturing amongst black men to light, and not necessarily to normalize them, but to show that characters like our character or people like our character are human beings. They yearn for things, they hurt. Because I think on the surface you assume that they don't have aspirations, and that they don't have past, but they do, and I think it's important to show those things.
Don't you find it a little bit depressing, though, that you're still almost having to prove the humanity of a young black man?
No, well, it was never my attempt to prove the humanity. It was just to showcase it. A friend of mine talks about the character played by Mahershala Ali and says, a black drug dealer is only ever a black drug dealer. He's never a father, he's never a son, an uncle, or a cousin. And drug dealing is never something he does. It's who he is. And so it wasn't about proving or disproving. It was just about showing people in their full humanity. And I think because Terrell and I are from the world this movie is set, often stereotypes arise from without the community, from the outside. I think when you're working from within, there's no type to be countered. You're just trying to bring real people to life.
So in a sense, this was very personal because you come from that world.
Extremely personal because I come from that world and because we decided to go back to that world to make the film, yeah.
And were there particular challenges in doing that, knowing that it's your own community?
Yeah, I mean, there were. One, there's always the pressure, you want to get things right, you want people to feel they're being represented in the right way. This film, from the very beginning, I had this mandate that there were going to be actors, trained actors, people like your countrywoman Naomi Harris, who does a great job in the film, but also, too, there were going to be people from the neighborhood who were in the piece. I wanted the neighborhood not to speak for itself, because clearly Terrell and I are the authors of the piece, but I did want the voice of the neighborhood to be a large part of it. It's why we set it in, the same blocks that we walked as kids, and we had people come into community centers and like, hey, do you want to be in a movie? We didn't say, hey, you want to be in a movie that's going to get nominated for 8 Academy Awards. At that point, it was just, do you want to be in a movie? Because we wanted to, not to create the neighborhood, we wanted to reflect it.
You mentioned Naomi Harris. She said that she was initially reluctant to take on the role because she was playing a black mother who has a drug problem, and she felt that that was a stereotype. And that you said to her, actually, I want you to play my mother. Mm-hmm. Just tell me a little bit about that conversation.
I knew exactly where Naomi was coming from. Naomi, and I think rightfully so, or virtuously so, doesn't want to portray negative images of black women. And I get that. I think for me, an overly positive image that robs some of the darkness, to me, is not productive. And so I said, look, I'm not trying to create a stereotype here. I'm working from the relationship I had with my mother, and I would never portray my mother in a way that did not embrace her full humanity. But I understood where she was coming from, because even in writing the piece, there's a version of Chiron's life that does not involve a mother addicted to drugs. And yet here I am, a guy sitting on this couch with you whose mom was addicted to drugs. Terrell McCraney is a MacArthur genius. His mom was addicted to drugs. To have removed that element of the story, or from my life, out of some sort of identity politics or out of shame, to me would have been to muzzle myself, to almost like an act of self-erasure. And so Naomi and I talked about that a little bit, and I think what it really drilled down to was, I don't have a bitterness or this grudge against my mom because of the things we went through. And I think what I tried to describe to Naomi was, in the creation of this character, it was coming from a place of tenderness and an attempt to understand, how things happen and why they happen. And I think Naomi really dug in, and she relished the opportunity to help me find those things.
You mentioned identity politics there. Mm-hmm. In light of the US election, there was a lot of analysis saying, actually, identity politics is where we've gone horribly wrong. Mm. We need to rethink that. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a luxury. I think for some people whose identities aren't as under duress as others, it's a luxury to say that identity politics are a waste of mental acumen. I think that there are certain people who grow up in the world, in society, who are watched by all of us, and we're constantly telling them, passively in some ways, but aggressively in others, that you are not allowed to be a certain way. Literally right now, this administration is telling us you are not allowed to do certain things with your body. I think if someone tells you can't do something with your body, it's going to directly affect your identity. So I don't think identity politics is where we've gone wrong. I think we need to double down and acknowledge the role we play in dictating to other people what their identities should be.
There were no white characters in the film.
No, not characters, but there are a few white people in the film,
yeah.
Yes.
but not main characters?
Not main characters.
Was that conscious?
It wasn't. The world I grew up in was exclusively black, and so the world of this character was always going to be exclusively black, and some people, now we're back to identity politics and think pieces, some people have, I think, accurately read into that, this passive systemic thing that happens in the States, where even though segregation is illegal through zoning laws, and loan practices, self-segregation occurs. And so in the world I grew up in, not that it was illegal for white people to be around, there just were no white people in the neighborhood I grew up in. And case in point, for this character, there were no white people in the neighborhood he grew up in, and so there were no white characters in the film.
You said you received some hate when the trailer went online, on Twitter and YouTube. What were people saying, and how did you respond to that?
I think I didn't respond for sure, because.
But I mean, how did you feel, even in your own when you're thinking through yourself? What was the response in your mind?
Look, I mean, I don't know what it feels like to walk down the street holding another man's hand and have people aggressively hate you simply for holding someone's hand. I think in some ways I got to feel a little bit of what that's like because I've created this piece that I think depicts a character whose sexuality involves walking down the street holding someone's hand. And I did it, I think, without judgment, I think with tenderness and with, as we've been saying, his full humanity intact. There are still people who are uncomfortable with things that they either haven't experienced themselves or that they have assumed they would rather not experience. And because of that, when you create these images, they respond. But this is all before seeing the work. And if there are people who every day have to live their lives under the scrutiny of folks who hate them simply for who they love, then as a creator of images, I can deal with having someone hate me for giving truth to the experience of others. I can take it.
Did it surprise you?
It did. It did. But I think partly because I tend to work in a vacuum in a certain way. I'm a process person, not a results person. So just as I didn't ever consider what the film would mean to people who identified with the character, it didn't occur to me to assume what the film would mean to people who don't and who are bitterly opposed to the character. But I got a taste of it as soon as that trailer dropped.
There are so many lingering, beautiful shots. It is a beautiful world, and yet they're difficult subjects, and he's living a harsh reality. Why was that contrast so important?
I didn't want to create one of these stories that reinforces the aesthetics of miserableism. I think when you grow up as a child, you normalize your conditions. You contextualize the world you live in, and life was tough. Yeah, sometimes we didn't have food to eat, but it was always surrounded by beauty. Miami is a beautifully gorgeous place. There was always bright light, open space, beautiful colors. And to have tried to, again, subdue those things from the image out of a fidelity to a miserableist tale, a social realist tale, would have been immoral because it would not have been truthful to the way Terrell and I grew up. And it's no surprise to me that you have two kids who grow up in this rampant poverty with moms who are addicted to crack cocaine, and yet they both end up going into arts and letters and creating these things that are quote unquote beautiful. It's because we were not robbed of beauty growing up as children. It was all around us.
In some senses, it is a specific story. It's one that obviously it's personal to you.
Extremely.
But do you think people outside of that world can relate to it? And if so, how?
Well, it's interesting. I don't even have to think about it. I have been all over Europe in the last 10 days showing this film to many different audiences from many different cultures, and cultures that are far removed from the culture I grew up in Miami. I think something happens when you drill down and try to be very honest about your experience. The way I describe it is I wasn't trying to make a character who could stand in for everyone. I was just trying to create a character who could stand in for himself. And I think in that specificity, in trying to understand how the city that he grew up in, the mom he lived with, affected him, someone who lives in rural Australia or wherever the hell, they can then drill down and think, well, where I live is very unique and strange too, and this is how my relationship with my mom was affected by the small community I live in. And so it becomes this thing where it's like one to one and not one to all. As I'm having such a hard time because I keep answering this question, and the only thing I can think is I just didn't try to make a film that could satisfy everyone. I just tried to make a film that had fidelity to the main character.
And in terms of casting the main character, we are seeing 3 different periods of life. How difficult was it to cast those 3 actors in a way that makes them marry up with each other?
Yeah, it wasn't difficult in and of itself. Like, there wasn't like 8,000 hoops each actor had to jump through, but it was arduous in the sense that it had to be these 3 guys. And then we had to do a very, very long and large search to find 3 young men who could just, as you say, have the same feeling. It's almost like it's not arithmetic, it's magic. And eventually the magic trick landed, it paid off. And I love that you say 3 different chapters and we cast 3 different people. The movie's sort of about how, as I was saying earlier, society is reshaping these young men, through these microaggressions. I call them purely aggressions. Through this feedback is telling them, don't behave this way, behave this way. A man does not look at another man this way. A man only looks at another man this way. And so when you see a different actor embody the same character, to me, it's already a signal to the audience. This is how society has changed this guy. Literally physically on the exterior, you can see how he's reshaped himself in this new performance of masculinity. But in their soul, in their eyes, I feel, you still see the same young man. And it's one of the things I'm happiest with or proudest of. But the film is how well all 3 of those young men, who are very, very different physical beings, they still carry the same spiritual essence.
Now, as much as you're exploring identity, the film isn't overtly political, but there was one line that I thought really stuck out for me, which said, "There's black people everywhere, we were the first people in this world." It's a very strong statement there. What was the meaning of that for you?
I think for me that there's a large element of this film that is about taking pride in the struggle of black people. Because I think the fact that we're still here means that we have triumphed quite a bit throughout that struggle. And for me, that line is not about the audience. It's more about what the character Juan is saying to the character Little, and trying to remind him that he is not alone. And I think, when he sees this kid who feels so detached from his immediate surroundings, he tries to impart in him this much larger sort of feeling of spiritual connection. And it's no surprise that it follows right after this scene that to me is basically a baptism, And to me it's just a reminder to any kid, who's watching this film, and maybe they live in a community where they're the only black kid, or they live in a community where they're the blackest kid, which is a whole different conversation, whole different think piece. And it's just to go, hey, you know what? There's so many of us, it's gonna be all right.
So what next for you?
I am now adapting a book by Colson Whitehead called The Underground Railroad, but I'm doing it as a limited series, not a feature film. And so slowly getting underway on that and somehow trying to make it through the next 30 days to see what happens with the Academy.